Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. This is Bloomberg Businessweek Daily, reporting from the magazine that helps global leaders stay ahead, with insight on the people, companies, and trends shaping today's complex economy, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. The Bloomberg Businessweek Daily podcast with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, let's get to some of the latest headlines. We've been talking about it. Israel and Iran exchanging fire for the fourth consecutive day today, stoking fears of an all-out war with the potential to drag in others in the oil-rich region, and Tim, force the U.S. into a more hands-on stance.
So that's the backdrop, along with trade tensions and more for this year's Group of Seven Summit. It's the 50th annual gathering of world leaders. It's happening right now in Canada. Speaking earlier from there, President Donald Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. Carney, though, we should note, is former chair of the board of directors at Bloomberg LP, the owner of Bloomberg TV and Radio. President Trump addressing the hostilities earlier in the Middle East.
They'd like to talk, but they should have done that before. I had 60 days, and they had 60 days, and on the 61st day, I said, we don't have a deal. They have to make a deal, and it's painful for both parties, but I'd say Iran is not winning this war.
All right, that, of course, is President Trump there with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney from the G7. Let's get more from the meetings. We head to Calgary, Alberta, Canada, our Bloomberg News Bureau there, and to Bloomberg News National Security Team Leader Nick Wadhams. Hey, Nick, good to be checking in with you. I know it's going to be a busy couple of days, busy week. There's a certain pomp and circumstance to all G7 meetings, a photo op, the family photo, so on and so forth. Every meeting, too, though, has specifics around it. And again, the geopolitical and macro backdrop set the scene for us this year around what's top of mind, like what is going on in the Middle East as we speak, and what else you're hearing is really on the minds of leaders.
Well, there's a lot on their minds. I mean, obviously, you see a lot of leaders coming here looking for common ground to send a message of unity around issues that really matter on trade, on Israel, Iran, on Ukraine, things like that. The big issue, of course, is whether President Donald Trump is going to be willing to go along. So far, we know he's refusing to sign a joint statement on the Israel-Iran conflict that would have called for de-escalation. The host, Mark Carney, has basically decided to dispense with the traditional joint communique that comes out of a meeting like this. So what you're seeing instead is a lot of leaders coming here looking to do bilateral deals with the U.S. on trade. So the Japanese Prime Minister will be here. You obviously have Canada. You have the UK looking to do its own trade deal. Claudia Sheinbaum, President of Mexico, not a member of the G7, but coming up as well. So they're all seeing this as a chance to sort of get Trump on neutral turf outside the spotlight of the Oval Office and try to cut a deal with him, given that it looks like the traditional role of the G7 as a place where Western leaders or democracies come together and sort of say, here's where we stand together and set these statements of principle. You know, they're just not going to be able to do that with Trump being such an outlier.
So does it seem like the takeaway from this, or the goal for at least for the United States and for other countries, would be to walk away from the G7 with some trade deals?
I think so. That's to make substantial progress. The president said, you know, it was achievable that they could do a deal with Canada here. I mean, there's not a ton of time. President leaves tomorrow night, as do the other leaders. So we're looking at about a 48-hour window, but they are looking for an opportunity to get something done. I mean, you know, more broadly, I think what Mark Carney essentially would want is to get out of here without a major blow-up. The last time there was a G7 meeting in Canada when Trump, in his first term, it ended in disaster when the president was flying out and he basically ripped up the joint communique, and it was a bit of an imbroglio for Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister at the time. So they'd like to sort of use this as a chance to mollify the president, at least create some image of unity. So far, though, Trump not necessarily willing to play along.
All right, and we're going to bring in David Gore in just a moment, because I want to get both of your thoughts on that. And I want to kind of play off of that, Nick, in that, you know, Bloomberg News, on reporting on the event too, specifically talked about how all the global leaders are trying to avoid conflict with President Trump. Is this President Trump at the center? He's got the biggest dance card and everybody dancing around him?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly true, though there are obviously a lot of other meetings and bilaterals. Every leader is coming here looking to essentially meet with every other leader. You are seeing a move to essentially establish a ceasefire for Gaza that's being orchestrated by the Italian delegation. So there's other stuff happening here, but it's just such a fascinating dynamic when you essentially have 6 united versus 1, and the U.S. being the outlier, but also obviously having the world's largest economy and the world's biggest military. I mean, you can't really get this stuff done without participation from the U.S. So it's creating some awkwardness up here.
All right, I want to bring in David Gora into our conversation. We're going to keep Nick Wadham still with us as well, but Bloomberg News correspondent, host of the Big Take podcast, David Gora, he's there in Banff, Canada. David, you two on the ground, like Nick, you guys pick up on kind of some of the nuances, but I want to ask you the same question about this idea of President Donald Trump kind of at the center of it all.
Yeah, I mean, I go back to sort of what we knew going into this, that we have a prime minister still fairly new to the job in Mark Carney, who really wanted to avoid what happened back in 2018, wanted to kind of reform the agenda so that there would be fewer landmines that he or other world leaders or Donald Trump could step into that could scuttle this whole thing. And I think what we saw this morning at that pool spray when Mark Carney was there with Donald Trump talking to reporters is, despite the prime minister's best laid efforts, all of that can kind of blow up in his face. So it was from that we got these remarks about Russia's previous involvement, and then what was the G8, now the G7, had him kind of musing about China playing a bigger role in this multilateral institution. Suffice to say, that's not something I think a lot of these other world leaders would be in favor of or even had considered going into this. So to Nick's good point, it's a very long and detailed agenda with a lot of meetings, both official and not. It's a long couple of days, and there are a lot of possibilities through which things can be changed radically by the comments of one world leader and by President Trump in particular.
What would a successful G7, David, look like to the United States and to President Trump as he leaves after a day?
I think before the crisis erupted in the Middle East, there was a lot of hope from this administration that some of these trade deals could be furthered. I'm sure they would say codified or signed, even though they don't seem to be in the position for that to happen. But I think they thought that the focus would be on what would come out of those bilateral meetings on the sidelines here vis-a-vis trade. And of course, what we've seen over the last few days has really cast a shadow over the proceedings in a way where that's unlikely to happen. And we saw both the president and other world leaders downplaying the likelihood of that happening over the course of this gathering. But I do look at President Trump in this forum in contrast with other G7s, including that one in 2018. And it's a president much more aware of the fact that he holds a lot of power here. There are a lot of eyes on him. And this notion of America first is now more firmly established. He feels more confident in that, and setting aside what's going on in the Middle East, recognizes the fact that he is the person with whom all these other world leaders want to meet and try to broker deals when it comes to trade policy. And there's a kind of confidence that comes from that I think is kind of eclipsing what we've seen in the past, which was his just kind of total disaffection with events like this one, finding them boring or not interesting or ponderous or unlikely to kind of yield the results that he would like to see.
Yeah, but there is something significant, right, that he is there and, a part of these meetings. Nick, come on back in on this conversation. Is there any feeling of global unity? And I say this with, Israel, Iran, that conflict. We still have Russia and Ukraine at war. There's a lot of stuff going on where not necessarily everybody agrees on how things should move forward from here. But I'm just curious, is there any signs of global unity? Again, and I do think it's significant that, President Trump ultimately is there.
Right, he is here. There was some speculation in the months before whether he would even attend. So his coming, I guess you could see that as a relatively good sign. But, even Mark Carney acknowledged in his opening remarks at this meeting, nostalgia is no longer going to suit us. We can't keep yearning for days gone by, which is essentially a recognition just how much things have changed. I mean, as David mentioned, you have this extraordinary moment. The first event of this whole conference was Trump meeting with Mark Carney for a bilateral, and Trump's first comment in that was what a huge mistake it had been to expel Russia from the G8 in 2014, and saying essentially that if they hadn't done that, the war in Ukraine never would have started. Of course, he got the facts wrong. He said Justin Trudeau had been the Canadian leader at the time. He wasn't. He also said that Russia was expelled. That was a mistake. Of course, Russia was expelled because it had invaded Crimea at the time, and when you invade a sovereign state like that, that's kind of incompatible with the principles of the G7. So it was a real signal at the time that Russia just could not be in this organization. So you see him immediately sort of coming in and almost asserting his dominance and separating himself from the other members. It's very hard to see how they can find common ground when the US president is basically coming in, essentially spoiling for a fight.
You know, it's interesting. I look at the global markets, and, you know, we've got a rally underway here in the U.S. We saw global markets, you know, bounce back on expectations, or some reporting by other news organizations about maybe the tensions between Iran and Israel and Iran easing. You know, you could kind of, whiteboard. You can kind of go a lot of different ways here. But David, come back in, because I think it's just a reminder that even on a market rally, there's just so much going on around the world at this moment. I think about the protests in the United States around the weekend. I'm looking at your backdrop. It looks awfully peaceful. You're in a pretty remote place, and my understanding some of that was to minimize protests at the G7 meetings.
Yeah, I think the geography is really important here. And so the meetings themselves are taking place in Kananaskis, which is a provincial park about an hour from where I am in Banff, and the media center is here. Some meetings are taking place here, some press conferences, and then there's also goings on in Calgary as well. But it's a triangle where each line of the triangle is about an hour from the other. So it was sort of deliberate from Mark Carney, the organizer, that you would get these leaders together in a very remote, isolated place, and maybe born out of that would be more opportunity for informal talks, a chance to kind of further those relationships. Again, drawing this contrast as I have to 2018, most of those principles from 2018 are gone. So it's a chance to start fresh. Obviously, the organizer, Mark Carney, hasn't been on the job for very long either. So it's kind of deliberate the way that all of this is set up, but you're wise to bring up all that's happening here. And you turn on the news, you listen to Bloomberg Radio or television or any network, and just see all that's happening. It is overwhelming. And again, there's the official agenda at this summit, and there's the unofficial one as well. And just kind of focusing on the Middle East in particular, I think that there was some hope from many of the leaders gathered here that, as we heard from them as they came here, there were statements about that crisis in the Middle East, this call for that to be de-escalated. I think there was hope that there could be kind of a unified statement of the G7 leaders on that issue. That's not going to be the case, it sounds like, coming out of this. That's not what Donald Trump, the President of the United States, wants at this point in time. He continues to call for diplomacy and for Iran not to have nuclear weapons. But you see just kind of the strain, even with something that is galvanizing so much attention, not just from world leaders, but from everyone, the U.S. kind of reluctant or unwilling to enter into that kind of statement, that group statement.
David, you mentioned the U.S. reluctance there, and it raises a bigger question, and we're going to ask Nick the same question too, which is, why in 2025 does the G7 matter? What is the significance in today's day and age?
You're asking me first or Nick?
You first, David. Then Nick. Nick gets some time to prepare.
You cannot take a pass.
And Nick can clean it up after. Look, I respect what the Prime Minister said about not being able to rest on nostalgia, but this has been a forum for 50 years, as the Prime Minister pointed out, nodding to the history of this multilateral institution, when these countries who started out as friends got together to work through and talk about a variety of issues of importance to all of them, and to kind of flex their might as democracies and leading economies. And I think fundamentally that continues to be the case here. They wield a lot of power, and I think, as all would say, if they can work together and find points of agreement, it makes them present a more powerful front to the world as a whole. I think that's why the G7 still matters. It is an occasion when these world leaders can get together, rare as it is, to have tough conversations and to think about the path forward. Obviously, we've seen the strains and the fissures here, not just at this summit, but at ones previous to it. But I think fundamentally just having that forum remains crucial for those who believe that multilateralism is something better than countries going it alone.
All right, over to you, Nick. Your thoughts on why G7 really still matters.
Well, I mean, I don't know if it's for me to say that it matters or not, though, but it is really interesting. I mean, when you look at, this situation, leaders come and go. I mean, when President Trump was last year, I think the only leader who was around the table who's here this time is Emmanuel Macron. So there's a lot of turnover. Who knows what happens from one year to the next. It is also, for us, a very interesting place in the sense that you can really pick up on some bigger global shifts. So last night, the European Union's Ursula von der Leyen was here. She gave a press conference and talked about pulling Canada more closely into the European defense infrastructure and architecture. And that was just sort of a fascinating moment for me. That's something they've talked about repeatedly over the last many months, but it shows these shifts that Europe wants to embrace Canada more and sort of implicitly pull it a little bit away from the United States. And that reflects this much broader unease about how things are shifting. The power dynamics are shifting geopolitically and globally, where Europe wants to find common cause with Canada and a little bit separate it or pull it away from the United States. And so you come to these events looking for clues where you're looking for those sort of broader, slower tectonic shifts in geopolitics.
So important, certainly at this moment in history. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it. Of course, we've been talking with Bloomberg News National Security Team Leader Nick Wadhams there in Canada, our news bureau there in Calgary, Alberta, and of course, Bloomberg News correspondent, host of the Big Take podcast, David Gore. He too on the ground there in Banff.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Businessweek Daily Podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Or watch us live on YouTube.
A couple things I'm sure you've heard about it, but we just want to remind everybody about the difficult weekend it was on the domestic front. U.S. prosecutors charged alleged shooter Vance Bolter with 2 counts of murder in the deaths of Minnesota State Representative Melissa Hortman and her husband in what officials referred to as a murderous rampage that was early Saturday morning. Also over the weekend, protesters rallying in hundreds of U.S. cities to denounce what they said were President Trump's authoritarian tendencies, including the increased deportations and tactics used to carry them out. You know, Tim, we kicked off talking about kind of global geopolitical tensions, but there is a lot going on the U.S. domestic home front.
So let's talk about that, domestic tensions that are simmering. Back with us is FGS Global partner Beth Vui. FGS Global is a public affairs consulting firm. Beth, a former senior politics editor at NBC News and MSNBC. She joins us here in the Bloomberg Businessweek studio. I want to start with the Minnesota shootings and look at them through the lens of the other political violence that we've seen over the last year or two. Assassination attempts on the president before he took office. We saw the murder outside of the consulate earlier this year in Washington, D.C. Of people in the U.S. there in what was, I think fair to say is perceived as political violence. There was a really depressing story, I believe it was yesterday in the New York Times, about how political violence in the U.S. is now becoming as routine as school shootings. Like, that's such a grim thing to even think about. What's going on here?
Well, I think you're seeing the conflagration of a couple of things. One is the very high-pitched tensions that everybody's feeling about politics. We know our country is extremely polarized, extremely divided. People on social media, their tempers getting, riled up. And then you add to it the element of guns, which we have in this country at a much, higher level than any other comparably civilized country. So the combination of the violent tendencies and the ability to execute literally and figuratively with a deadly weapon makes us unique. It's a very scary time for sure, particularly for those public officials who are finding themselves really under scrutiny, under attack. We could have mentioned Nancy Pelosi's husband being, that didn't involve a gun, but clubbed right in his home. The J6 folks who attacked the Capitol with weapons, clubbing, hurting, killing in some cases police officers. We're in a very fraught moment right now, and there doesn't seem to be much sign of cooling. And I would say the other problem we're facing is as soon as one of these things happens, everybody jumps to conclusions about why. What was the shooter's motive? What was the attacker's motive? Which political side are they on? Granted, right now we're seeing more violence happening on the right, but it would behoove everyone if they didn't jump onto Twitter or jump onto X or what have you and make assumptions about what's going on here. A lot of times people have very complicated histories. They might suffer from mental illness. We need to learn more before we sort of draw all sorts of conclusions about why people are doing what they're doing.
Completely agree, right? You got to know all of the information, something. Having said that, there is something about freedom of speech, peaceful protesting. I feel like, look at on college campuses where we used to embrace different thoughts, right? And different political views, where all of a sudden that's almost like it doesn't happen anymore. So there is something else going on. And I'm just curious, your thoughts on that, because that certainly plays into the political tensions that we're seeing here.
Yeah,
like the inability to have, we do it here all the time, have conversations in the newsroom where we all don't necessarily agree, but we learn from each other.
Yeah.
But something has gone away on a national level.
Yeah, it doesn't feel that way, doesn't it? I mean, it does feel like there was a period of time, maybe not that long ago, where one could have sort of a civil conversation with people that you may or may not agree with. College campuses, I mean, what we've seen, in most recently is the activity around Israel-Palestine, Israel-Gaza. That has motivated a lot of college students. It has, brought lots of accusations of Jewish students being mistreated on campus, or the free speech of folks who want to demonstrate on the behalf of the Gazans not being allowed to, or being, in the case of Colombia, police being brought into the campus to break down those camps last year. I mean, we saw a lot of rage, a lot of anger. Unfortunately, yes, because we're dealing with a very fraught political environment, and tensions are running high.
And yet we have social platforms where we have a president of the United States that certainly feels free to post at will. I would say business leaders like an Elon Musk who feel very comfortable to post at will. So it's just like
he actually owns his own platform.
No, I understand. Right, and that's become the new media, right? That very wealthy people seem to buy into to kind of be able to do that. But it's just this unevenness of certain folks being very comfortable saying whatever they want, and then a lot of Americans feeling nervous, or business leaders. How many business leaders do we have come into our room who will talk off air saying there's fear about really saying what they feel about various policies?
Yeah, and at our firm we deal with those kind of
what do you
clients
hear from
all the
leaders?
time. I mean, they want to stand by their values, but they're also very worried about drawing scrutiny, perhaps from the administration, drawing backlash from their consumers about the practices that they've decided to engage in. So they're very nervous about expressing themselves in any way at all, and that's an uncomfortable feeling to have as a leader, to not be able to sort of say where you stand, where you believe your company stands, where you want to represent as a leader going forward, and feeling like you can't do that.
One thing that we're talking a lot about here is not just the protests against ICE in Los Angeles and the riots and, what happened there over the last week or so, but also the way that the president and his administration are thinking about immigration, because it seems like there has been some change there, specifically with regard to farm workers, workers within the hospitality industry. It seems like leaders are talking to him and saying, wait a second, we're actually having trouble finding workers. There have been a lot of different presidents that have tried to solve this. Will this administration, in your view, does it have the tools to actually make change here?
Well, I mean, the fact that the president has had to acknowledge that certain industries will not function without this labor force is really quite surprising, given that he did campaign. He was very obvious about what he intended to do. He said he was going to deploy federal forces to get rid of people living here illegally. He didn't differentiate one or the other. He said, we're going to go for the criminals, and then we're going to go for everyone else. He is now recognizing the fact that much of our economy runs on this labor. There's no obvious replacement for these folks. So he's going to have to make some changes. That said, he also just came out last night and again this morning announcing that he was going to deploy ICE into Democrat-run cities in order to purge folks out of those places specifically, and he named what he said was illegal voting by undocumented people, which that basically does not happen at all. Well, there's tons and tons of research on this. But it was basically him announcing that he's going to use ICE as a political tool, not just a tool to remove people who are here illegally, but rather to target places that are he opposes politically, or they oppose him.
Is it more about culture war optics versus immigration policy that we're seeing with President Trump? And just got about 30 seconds.
Yeah, look, I mean, that was something that he ran on was immigration, and he was very much had the sympathy of many Americans who felt like our immigration policy had gone out of control. But what they are doing now, this sort of ramping this up, just taking people wholesale out of the country without really looking at their situation, not putting them through due process. There's a big backlash against that now.
All right, going to leave it there. Covered a lot of ground. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Beth Fooey, FGS Global Partner, joining us right here in studio.
This is the Bloomberg Businessweek Daily podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 2 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Okay, let's talk energy. It's the second worst performing sector in the S&P 500 right now. It was the worst performing. Utilities taking a leg lower.
Right?
There is some bouncing around.
Did you see WTI crude was up 6% at one point and down 5% at one point? So that's the kind of day we've had.
Go figure. Figure. That's why we got Rob Thummel here, Senior Portfolio Manager at Tortoise Capital. They've got around $9.6 billion in assets under management. Rob manages several of the funds, including the Tortoise Energy Infrastructure Total Return Fund, up this year more than 4%. Rob, good to have you with us. Oil up 26% since May 5th. I couldn't believe this. I was doing this.
You were shocked.
When we were preparing for this, I yelled across the desks to Carol, what is going on? We know what happened in the last week and why the tensions in the Middle East. Oil has moved up since then. But why a steady push higher since the end of last month?
Yeah, Doug, I think, Tim. Tim, I meant.
We were talking about
we were talking about Doug. I meant to talk to Tim. So what I think is
Doug
happening
Sioka, you can say thank you. Shout
out to Doug.
Talking about you.
Tim, what I think is happening is I think there's more certainty about the demand for oil, right? So the global economy continues to prosper. The oil inventories are really very low. So any disruption or any potential disruption is really going to cause a spike in oil prices. So obviously we had a big disruption or concern about a disruption. Actually, we have never had any physical volumes.
What exactly is the concern? Like with a skirmish between Israel and Iran, is the concern about the Strait of Hormuz? Is that what the concern is?
That's exactly it, Tim. That's
so explain
the biggest
what could
concern.
happen.
So the Strait of Hormuz is really important. So the U.S. is the largest producer of oil in the world, 13.3 million barrels. For context, we produce about 100 or consume about 100 million barrels a day. But
we consume. Okay, say that again. We consume about 100 million barrels a day.
Globally, 100 million barrels a day. 100 million barrels a day are consumed globally.
Okay.
20%, 20 million barrels a day, roughly, go through that Strait of Hormuz. So if that supply is cut off for some reason, and remember, Iran is very close to that strait. It's at the base of the strait. So if that's cut off for any reason, for any point in time, the world just doesn't have enough inventory to deal with that for a long period of time. So that's anytime there's escalating conflicts near the Strait of Hormuz, oil prices are going to go up higher. Do
we see that reflected in the delta between Brent crude versus West Texas Intermediate?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, sometimes, but they tend to move together because the U.S. can export oil, right? So if oil prices move higher globally, Brent, then typically you'll see WTI move up accordingly as well.
Okay, one more on the numbers just to set the stage for us. 100 million barrels a day is what we use as a globe.
Yeah.
You said the U.S. exports how much?
Well, the U.S. exports 5 or 6 million barrels a day.
And we produce?
The 13.
13. And how much do we use?
Well, we use a little around 15 to 20, roughly.
So, and we always have to import some because of what we produce here isn't necessarily the right type of oil for us to use.
That's right. So we import some from Canada and from other areas of the world as well because of the quality of the oil. That's right.
So we're not awash in oil?
Well, in some ways we are. Do you think? If you think about the conflicts we've had, Carol. These are massive. This is a massive conflict affecting geopolitical risk. But yet, oil prices are actually down, as you mentioned, and are really not that high relative to the conflict that the world is experiencing.
So my understanding is too that usage has been declining as well, right?
Well, global oil demand, it's slowing. It's slowing, right? Global oil demand is still growing. We set a record last year for global oil demand, the highest it's ever been. It'll be higher this year than it was last year. But you're right, global oil demand is slowing.
So what do you make of, we talked about global growth, and I just want to make sure I heard correctly, because the OECD one forecast has lowered its global GDP growth forecast for this year to 2.9%, down from 3.1% in its previous projection. I think initially when we started, you talked about that the global economy is kind of firing on all cylinders. Is that really the case?
Well, I think it's improving. The certainty related to the global economy, I think, with less concern about tariffs, right? And so I think that's oil prices really sold off earlier this year because of two things: uncertainty related to tariffs and the impact of the economy, and then the adding to the supply that OPEC Plus was adding. They were adding volumes, additional volumes when maybe the demand wasn't there. That's one of the reasons why then the more certainty has really created the opportunity for higher growth in oil prices.
Rob, from your perspective, and you've got to make investments based on what's going on in the global energy markets. What do you think is a realistic longer term trend for WTI crude right now? We're right now just above $71 a barrel.
Yeah, so I think WTI right where we are, about $70 in the 70s is a long-term trend. I think we're going to be lower in the near term, but I think longer term you'll see some adjustments made. The U.S. might be flat and even maybe decline in production next year. And so as a result of that, then you'll probably see demand go up for oil globally and domestically, and then the U.S. will have to then return to producing more.
I got a lot of messages coming at me from interested viewers and listeners who are curious about the international relations side of this, specifically Iran. They're not so concerned about the Strait of Hormuz closing because he argues that the Strait of Hormuz closing would hurt Iran more than it hurts the rest of the world. Is the incentive not necessarily aligned there?
Well, I think that's a very astute point. And the other point to be made related to that is the two largest consumers of oil, the U.S. and China, basically are really interested in. China in particular buys a lot of Iranian crude oil. So I think it would be very difficult for the Strait of Hormuz to really to close. And so as a result, then I'm not too concerned either.
And then a question, too, about the escalation of tensions between these two countries. Does it move beyond Israel and Iran? And what are the implications if that does happen?
Well, I sure hope not. I mean, just for the world, right? For all of us as human beings. But it's really going to be difficult to disrupt the crude oil supply, basically. And so I just don't see the crude oil supply, because of its significance in growing the global economy. I just don't see it being disrupted. And so as a result of that, I just think oil can trade at a probably lower from here, which is a good thing for all of us as consumers, especially as we start the summer driving season.
So what's the smart investment play? I'm looking at the Tortoise Energy Infrastructure, and I'm looking, I think your number one holding, but correct me, I think this was as of the end of April, was MPLX Limited.
That's one of our, we like MPLX. Yeah, go ahead. That's an infrastructure name, Carol. So it's a high dividend yield. It's probably 7.5%, 8% dividend yield. It grows itself about 3 or 4% a year. So is
it the infrastructure that you like because it doesn't kind of matter? It's just you got to be moving stuff around.
Like the infrastructure and like natural gas. So we really think the energy sector is being redefined, and going forward, that natural gas will actually take the leading role as one of the larger supply growth commodities. Really, not only domestically but also around the world as well.
So I'm thinking about this in the context of sort of what Carol was asking about when it comes to quote unquote energy independence, or the way that American firms are being encouraged by the administration to drill and to explore for oil in the United States and extract oil in the United States. Do you see that happening during this administration, or will it not happen because the price won't get high enough?
Yeah.
Sustainably high enough.
Yeah. And Tim, it's a good observation. What I'd say is the U.S. is still the largest energy producer in the world. That's not going to change in this administration. It's probably not going to change in any administration. The U.S. has a lot of energy, a lot of cheap energy that it can not only use domestically, but export as well. Now, what we are going to see is, as you highlight, lower oil prices is resulting in now a lower rig count in the U.S., which will ultimately result in lower production in the U.S. And it's because of the price. So the oil producers need a little higher price, basically. They need oil to be in the 70s or 80s to really increase production.
Well, let's remind everybody, right? This is cyclical. And I think about, being up in Williston, North Dakota, in the Bakken in 2011, and it was just off the chart, and everybody's drilling. And again, I've said this a million times, the locals there are like, we've seen this before. So, I mean, this is just like semiconductors, right? There's, a demand and not enough supply, and the price goes to where it needs to be, and people start to infrastructure spend, build out, and then supply goes up and the price goes down.
The cure for high prices is high prices.
What?
The cure for high prices is high prices.
Yeah, exactly. So is that kind of where we are?
Yeah,
or not yet?
And the cure for low prices is low prices. So you're right. So we're going to see less drilling. But here's the difference this time, I think, and I think this is really important for people to understand, is the companies themselves are in much better financial condition. Their balance sheets are much improved. And so you don't have to worry about these companies these days as much from a credit perspective. They're much more improved from a balance sheet perspective.
All right. But infrastructure is your play?
We love infrastructure. Love infrastructure and natural gas at Tortoise.
All right. Gonna leave it. Hey, good to see you.
Thank you.
Rob Thumel, Senior Portfolio Manager at Tortoise Capital.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Businessweek Daily Podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Or watch us live on YouTube.
I'm driving in my car.
How about you let me drive?
Oh, no. This is not a toy.
Who's gonna drive you home?
Honey, please, I'll do the driving.
Drive on.
Excuse me, I want to drive.
It's the question that drives us.
This is the Drive to the Close
That funky music will drive us till the dawn.
on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, TikTok, everybody. Just about 17 and a half minutes to go until we wrap up the trade on this Monday, June 16th. I just heard from Charlie and Bill Maloney wrapping up the trade for you as we get ready for the close. And yeah, we're off our best levels of the session, but we have seen some optimism, some risk on trade, if you will, Tim, come back into the market.
Well, let's get into it with Chris Fasciano, Chief Market Strategist at Commonwealth Financial Network. He's here in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. One thing that I think was surprising to a lot of people, we're going to zoom out and talk about the big picture trade, but as far as today goes, I think people have been really surprised at the market reaction during an ongoing skirmish in the Middle East, one that hasn't shown more trepidation when it comes to risk on assets. What gives?
Yeah, this has been a headline-driven market this entire year, right out of the gate, right? Whether it's tariffs, trade policy, the deficit, or geopolitical conflict. And I think what we're seeing today is there have been the stories out there that Iran has reached out to the U.S. and Israel to try to negotiate some kind of deal. So the market's view is that this conflict, which they were very worried about on Friday, looks like it's going to be contained. And as long as it's contained and doesn't impact the U.S. economy, which means higher oil prices, potential for higher inflation, and a concern for the Fed, they're willing to look through it and go back to what they believe the fundamentals are currently.
Chris, the velocity and volume of the news flow, be it from the White House or just around the globe, does it create opportunities or does it kind of make investors in your world say, I'm out?
I think it creates opportunities. My view is volatility always creates opportunities. But it's really hard when talking to our advisors and they're hearing from clients to get them to see that at a time like April, right? So I've lived through a lot of these market sell-offs, and what I always say is the catalyst is different. And that's what our advisors were hearing from clients in March and April. This is different this time. Catalysts are different. But the market action always tends to be the same, which I mean by that is that it's driven by the future outlook for the economy and corporate earnings. So when you get a big sell-off, you can start to look at things like valuations and you can start to make decisions.
But having said that, you know, if it is different this time around and the catalyst, which is often from the White House, and to be fair, I think we can all say safely that the back and forth on some of the policies from President Trump and his team, but largely from the president, make it difficult to figure out what impact will there be longer term on corporate earnings and all that good stuff.
Yes.
And so that to some extent is, well, wait, how do I make a decision when the variables are still up in the air?
Right. I think that's absolutely true. But one of the interesting or unique things about policy compared to like the financial crisis is that policy can change. And that's what we've seen, right? Tariffs are announced at very high levels. It appears as though the president is using tariffs as a negotiating tool. Market reacts negatively and the policy gets changed and we have a pause in effect.
Are you concerned about the lack of actual concrete trade deals that have been announced? And by I mean like none out of 90. Right, 90 deals in 90 days was what we were supposed to see, right? The 90 days is
July 9th is coming.
That's like less than a month away.
Yeah, July 9th is coming. And I think we all know that the way deals work is they get negotiated at the last minute, right? And I think that's what you're seeing. The G7's going on, right? And I've seen stories that the president is meeting with his counterparts from the EU and Canada and Mexico. So I still believe we're going to get some kind of headlines, but I don't believe we're going to get fully negotiated deals by July 9th. What the market wants to see, something similar to what they saw with the UK, which is a template that says, here's what we agree.
What would you call? Would you call that a template, a framework? What would you call it?
I'd call it a framework.
Okay, not an actual trade deal.
No, you can't negotiate trade deals that quickly. I mean, we look back at like 2018. It took almost 18 months to negotiate phase one with China back then.
So like an MOU, right?
Yeah. Yes. Exactly.
And then, hey team, go figure it out.
Right. Exactly. I think we're going to see those as we approach July 9th.
So glass half full, glass half empty.
Glass half full. Yeah, I think this is a fascinating market, right? Because I say if you're a type of person that doesn't look at your statement every month and you looked at it in January and you looked at it last week, you'd say nothing happened. You'd be wrong, but you might be better off than all of us.
Where do I find that attitude to just like not even? The problem is I'm in the markets every day. in terms of news?
Yes,
But
absolutely.
But I would argue that sometimes it's hard to erase
right.
the whipsaw that we got.
Yes.
And it's a reminder that we do have an administration, a president in particular, again, I'm not talking out of line, that can say one thing and then do a 180.
Right.
And so we're not done. This administration goes on for another three and so many, 3 years and so many months.
Yep.
And so things can change
They can.
again.
Right. So the way you framed the question, I said half full because I look at it, we're basically back to where we were in January in terms of market levels and valuations, right? So,
yeah, but what a ride.
Right. It's been a wild roller coaster. But that makes me cautiously optimistic that going forward, the economy, which had so much momentum coming into the year, that it was able to persevere through the headwinds, will continue to grow in the back year. Corporate earnings will continue to grow. That will be supportive for equity investors. But to your point, I don't think volatility is going away. And I think there are risks out there that investors need to be cognizant of.
How would you characterize the economy right now? The consumer powers this economy. There are concerns that cracks are starting to form. Do you agree with that?
There are concerns cracks are starting to form. There's no doubt. We saw that with consumer confidence that basically cratered in the first half of the year. Although on Friday we saw it tick up after the pause with China. But the way I look at it is the driver of the consumer is employment and jobs. You are seeing that slow, but you're still seeing it at levels that should be supportive for the consumer, which means that they will continue to spend money, which means the economy should continue to grow as long as we continue to get progress on tariffs and we got a budget bill passed that could begin to add stimulus into the economy late in the year as we enter next year.
Just real quickly, are you worried though, again, this is a question Tim and I ask about the U.S. being uninvestable and that investors moving away from dollar-based assets. U.S. importers are increasingly being asked by their foreign counterparties to settle transactions in currencies other than the U.S. dollar, such as euros, Chinese renminbi, Mexican pesos, and Canadian dollars. I mean, that's happening.
Yes. As I said, there are a lot of things to worry about, and I think investors need to be cognizant of them. To your point, is the U.S. uninvestable? I don't believe that. But throughout this year, I have been talking to our advisors about increasing their international exposure because not only is it cheap, but we're starting to see improvements in fundamentals, and I think that will continue to drive that trade.
All right, Chris Fasciano, Chief Market Strategist at Commonwealth Financial Network. Thank you so much.
Good to be here.
This is the Bloomberg Businessweek Daily podcast. Available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.